Hello and welcome to A Theory of Everything. We've been away for a couple of years, but we're back and hopefully stronger than ever. We have plans to interview some very interesting people like we have in the past. And today's session is going to be an open conversation with Ruben Navarrette. He's an old friend of mine and a college classmate. Ruben, would you be nice enough to introduce yourself, and then I'll kind of give an overview of what we're going to talk about?
Absolutely. My pleasure. Great to be with you, my good friend, my old friend. We have known each other since we were freshmen in college back in, let's see, 1985, the fall of. And we were different people then, and certainly our country was different then than it is today here in the United States. Um, and so by way of background, I'm what how do you break this down? So I'm a lot of things to a lot of people, right? I'm somebody's son. My mom and dad were both born in the U.S., one in Texas, one in California. My dad was a law enforcement officer for 37 years, a cop for 37 years, really enforced in the way I see the world, really influenced it. And then my three of my four grandparents were born in the U.S. They were born in Texas, and my grandfather, my fourth grandparent, my dad's dad, Ruben Navarrette, was born in Chihuahua, Mexico, and he came to the United States legally in the early 1900s, but no gold star for grandpa, I always say in my talks, because you couldn't come illegally until 1924, until after 1924. The Immigration Act of 1924 was really important and set up these per country quotas. But the Mexican Revolution lasts from 1910 to 1920. So when we know that my grandfather came as about an 8-year-old boy with his family during the Mexican Revolution, ergo he came before 1924. And so, like a bunch of other people, he came illegally before you could come illegally. So no gold star for grandpa or the Irish or the Italians or anybody else who came before 1924. So that's kind of my beginnings. I have a great love for immigration and an appreciation of immigrants are the best thing about the country. My grandpa's experience taught me so. And then I have a respect for law and order. And I don't take kindly to lawbreakers in the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. And it's my job as a journalist to call them both out. I'm Ruben in the Center. My podcast is called Ruben in the Center because I have, for 37 years, been a journalist. I've worked for 3 different newspapers. I've written for 10 different magazines and done talk radio, hosted talk radio shows in 5 different U.S. cities. I've worked for major TV networks like CNN. I was on CNN for 20 years. And I just got into this line of work. Luis, it's really interesting how things happen, but I kind of got into this line of work because I went to college. When I met you, I was going to become a lawyer. I enjoyed the courses I took at Harvard Law School. I enjoyed the law, but I had this desire to write. And I had gotten some encouragement in high school to be a writer and high school English teacher who had said, there's some writing ability here. And then I crossed paths with a writer of note, Richard Rodriguez, who wrote a book called Hunger of Memory and many other books after that. And he encouraged my writing while I was still in college. And one thing led to another. And I started publishing pieces in the Los Angeles Times and just kept writing. I got a book deal right out of college. I graduated in college at 23, and I think I got the book deal at 24. And then wrote it when I was 25, and it was published when I was 26. And then at that point, I just lost track of the law and decided to become a writer. So this is what I do. I'm a professional communicator. I write and give speeches. I have a Substack, Navarrette the Nation Substack, and I have last but not least, a syndicated column through now Creator Syndicate. For 24 years, it was at the Washington Post Writers Group, and now it's a Creator Syndicate. So I've been a nationally syndicated columnist for a quarter century. So all that. Can I just say, my friend, that you and I have commented about this before. That bio is like, it's the professional stuff. I always think more about the personal stuff. I think about my 3 kids who are 16, 18, and 20. I think about my relationship with my wife, who's so much, better, smarter than I am, more accomplished than I am. I have 1 master's degree. She has 2. I think about my relationship to my aged parents, and who are in their 83, 84 years old, and the challenges there and caretaking for them. So really, the bio is how they introduce you when you give talks in public. That's the public me, but it's the private me that really occupies a lot of my time and thought and effort. That's really the exhausting part of life is trying to be a good dad and trying to be a good son and trying to be a good husband and friend and all those things. That's the part that really is very taxing, but also the most rewarding. So that's it.
Okay, well, interesting. But you've chosen a path professionally that excuse me, necessarily or perhaps inevitably connects these very deep personal issues with very public issues. So you're on the political scene. You have to stay on top of everything that's happening around you in U.S. and the world. Tell us about the changes that you have experienced from, because you have 2 degrees from Harvard, and the changes that have taken place since that time, since your education there. What was going through your mind as you made those commitments to first to go to Harvard and then go back to Harvard for a master's degree? What was happening at the time, and how have things changed since then?
Yeah. I think the best way to approach that is what was happening in the society at large in our country, as opposed with what was happening with me. I think that in terms of the country, the Harvard that I went back to, let's start there. If you look at the time that we were together, we had probably at Harvard, I think, the best president that Harvard's ever had. It's the consensus view that our best president was Derek Bok. He was our president. And he looks pretty good in hindsight. And he is someone who was very skilled, former dean of Harvard Law School. But I got to tell you, I've never spoken about this publicly, but I'll tell you, just because I just didn't think who would be interested in this. But there was a time, and let me focus on how this goes back to you. There was a time when I was about to graduate senior year, where I wrote a piece, one of my first op-eds in the Los Angeles Times, and I took that and it was all about sort of Harvard and how Harvard could be much better, and I thought Harvard could be better by not simply kind of admitting and forgetting Latino students, for instance, but if you're really serious about being a world-class, internationally known university, you want to pay attention to this changing demographic and the fact that Latinos are going to become much more prominent in the future. Lo and behold, 30 years later, here we are. Latinos are 64, 65 million people. 1 in 5 Americans is Latino. So the message to Harvard at the time was, if you want to be a player, so to speak, in the future, you're going to want to do better by these Latino students, which means you're going to have to find some way of creating a more nurturing environment. So I'd written that in a piece, and I went down to University Hall, where I think it's actually Massachusetts Hall. It's where the president's office was. And then I would go and I went there and I put it into his inbox, literally. And then I got a call back from his office that he wanted to meet with me. And I met with President Bok a couple, maybe 6 weeks before graduation, something like that. And the nature of our conversation was basically me trying to push him to see that while liberals like to talk about being colorblind, kind of, and particularly sort of New England liberals, white liberals, the idea of being colorblind as if they're doing us a favor by ignoring the fact that we're Latino, that was really not a smart way to go, because it made the Latino students feel like there was something that we were doing wrong. There was some sort of, some affliction they had to be overlooked or something. And that really they should find a way to celebrate our differences instead of ignoring them. And so that was the general take of it. And the conversation ended well, and him saying, well, I liked your piece, you're a good writer, you should think about writing. But when you asked where we were, at least at that time, was still kind of in a traditional sense where conservatives were griping about things like affirmative action, thinking that race shouldn't be a factor in admissions and at colleges. And liberals were backed into this position of defending those programs and saying, you know what we're going to do? It doesn't matter to me, Ruben, that you're Latino. It doesn't matter that you're Mexican American. I'm going to treat you like I would a white guy. And me thinking, wait a minute, I don't want to be treated like a white guy. I don't want you to treat women as if they were men. I don't want you to treat, members of the LGBTQ community as if they were straight. I don't want you to treat Latinos as if they were white. I want you to see us as we are, and not think of it as a negative. And so that's kind of where I think we used to be. And where we are now is many years later is at a place where I think white supremacy has become much more in vogue, at least I'd say in both parties, but particularly in the Republican Party. And white people are not embarrassed about pushing back and saying that programs like affirmative action or DEI or any of these programs, while they're really hurting white people, we're going to do away with them. So the idea of the white male victim, I must have heard this years ago. It's gotten louder and louder and louder. And now it really runs policy because, and I'll end with this, because in the White House, you have now a twice elected president who is the epitome of the white male victim, who thinks he's being victimized and picked on by the media, by academia, by law firms, by you name it. And so he is a perfect representative, the president, for this moment in American history.
Well, you've covered a lot of ground there. One of the interesting topics for me, and I think for people in general, is this concept of DEI. I know recently Charlie Kirk was, of course, assassinated, and that was tragic. But one of the things that was apparently constantly on his mind and in his conversations is this profound dislike or even hatred for DEI. Talk to me about how you feel about DEI, because both you and I think are very relevant to this conversation because we are both a Mexican American background. We got into an elite institution, probably at the height of affirmative action. So what's your take? And aren't we in some sense a very relevant case studies for this? What do you think about this?
So DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's kind of a catch-all phrase that says that universities and corporations that are mostly white and have traditionally been white, whether it's a Fortune 500 company or a law firm or university or whatever, that they should try to make themselves more diverse, more equitable, more inclusive. And that has become incredibly controversial in recent years because, as I said before, if you're Charlie Kirk, you see DEI as a threat. You see it as something that is lowering standards, bringing in too many people of color, as he put it, taking spots away from more qualified white people. Charlie Kirk said about Black people, and he did, I think, target Black people much more than he did brown people. But we were in the mix. He said that if you're Ketanji Brown Jackson, the Supreme Court Justice, who went to Harvard undergraduate and Harvard Law School, if you're Michelle Obama, who went to Princeton undergraduate and Harvard Law School, well, you must know you're unqualified for any job you have, that you took it away from you stole it, use the word stole, you stole it from a more qualified white male. And so for people who believe that, and there is a big section apparently of America that does believe that, and they live in our neighborhoods and they're all around us, the only qualification they need to have there, Luis, is that they have a son or daughter who's applying to college. And there's a lot of pressure involved in applying to college in the United States. And if they don't get into Stanford or Harvard or Yale, they're going to blame somebody. And they got to blame, the Black kid who took their spot. There may be 5 Black kids at Yale, but chances are they say that one of those 5 Black kids took my kid's spot. They never think about that kid being outgunned by another white person. And so from Charlie Kirk's perspective, and he was very blunt about it, and he was very helpful because he left behind all this video to prove the things he'd said. He believed that somehow programs like affirmative action lowered standards. Here's the part that I find difficult. If you looked at our freshman class at Harvard, there were 2,000 people who were admitted, 1,600 showed up in the class of 1989. Of the 1,600 who showed up, and there was a mixer in the freshman year, sort of people gathering in the yard before class started, an impromptu gathering before classes started freshman year. If you have 1,600 freshmen, of the 1,600 freshmen, there are 35 Mexican Americans. 35 Mexican Americans, that's 2.5%. That was you and me. So you and me and 33 others. And if you looked at us, typically you saw light skin, you had no Spanish, Some of us went to private schools, class valedictorian in my case. There were athletes in your case, and so you were a scholar athlete. Highly desirable people, high SAT scores. And Harvard typically, and from my perspective, and this is like something I touched about in my book, which was called A Darker Shade of Crimson, Odyssey of Harvard Chicano, but I wrote about my experience in college. My sense was that Harvard was very timid about affirmative action. It didn't want to let in the wrong kind of Latino, so it let in sort of the cream of the crop. You know, I could think right now of 50 or 60 people I grew up with in San Diego, California, and Central California, who ended up in gangs, who ended up, finding economic challenges, ended up on drugs, and all these things. Some went to jail. And Harvard was, in a way, trying to steer clear of that population. So it let in people like you and me that are very, safe. We're safe. The best example I can give you of this is that at Yale, when I was at Harvard at Yale, you had Terry Cisneros, who was Henry Cisneros' daughter. I went to school at Harvard with Quincy Jones's daughter. If you saw African Americans and Latinos at Harvard, they were coming from sort of the elite, upper class, wealthy, rich, or at least not rich like you and I were working class, but smart as hell. I look at you and I look at me and I don't think, wow, somebody lowered standards to let these guys get into Harvard. I think that these are two smart and capable and hardworking people who got in on the natural. And so that's kind of, I think, how we fit into this. So DEI, tries to diversify those places. They're taken on voluntarily by the place, by the corporation, the law firm, the university, but it's become a boogeyman for people who think that somehow you and I are getting ahead by pulling down more qualified white people. It's been my experience. I'll leave this. I've been in media for 37 years. I've worked for CNN. I've worked for the Washington Post. I've worked for all sorts of places. Some of the most mediocre people I've run across are white men. I've run across some incredibly mediocre white men who are not very smart, who don't work very hard, who think of themselves as entitled. And nobody says boo when they go up the ladder. When you and I go up the ladder, everybody watches us. So I really don't lose a lot of sleep at night thinking that I took a spot from a more qualified white guy, because I haven't met that many of them.
Well, what struck me about Kirk and his various statements about DEI, and by the way, I've been quite vocal in my own personal circles about asking people or inviting people, anybody who wants to talk about this on camera, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And for some reason, despite all of the constant chatter about these things, I can never get anybody to talk about it. Say, let's talk about it on camera. Well, I saw many contradictions in Kirk, one of them being his incessant focus on Black intelligence or lower IQ, and his presumed higher IQ, and this hypocrisy of him being against DEI, yet it was well known that he would go around recruiting Blacks who felt like him into positions of influence on social media. So he was practicing, while he was expressing his hatred for DEI, he was practicing it himself. So I said he was literally doing it. He was selecting Blacks who he felt were useful to him and giving them more visibility on social media and whatnot. So I felt that was a hypocritical thing for him to do. In addition, his incessant concentration or obsession with Black crime, and it strikes me as unfitting or inappropriate for a white male in the United States of all countries to point fingers about any other group about being criminals. In particular, I think this is relevant in the United States, because if you look at the history of the United States, I mean, it's a history of, like many countries and like maybe human history in general, But the history of the United States is especially violent and especially criminal. On the one hand, because of slavery. On the other hand, because of what the Anglo-Saxons did to the indigenous population. It's a systematic extermination or displacement of the indigenous population. And so for somebody to do this, to not talk about what the US government has done over the years with regime change and with wars, incessant wars, with Afghanistan, Iraq, these endless wars. So the American whites have been responsible for a totally disproportionate amount of crime and deaths compared to blacks. So the amount of black crime in the US is totally trivial compared to this, the amount of damage and harm that the white Americans have done.
Can I follow up on that?
Sure.
You give me an idea. There's this phenomenon whereby you may meet someone who is very interested in talking about a topic, any topic, but not in full. Let's say the topic is abortion or guns or the death penalty, or you pick a topic, but they're not interested in having a full discussion, a 360 discussion. They only want to talk about part of it. And I see this in politics all the time, where people don't want to admit anything that their side is doing wrong, right? I think you see this now with political violence, a good example. When there's an act of political violence, Republicans will point to the Democratic versions of Democrats who are harming Republicans, but they'll ignore instances of Republicans harming Democrats. Democrats do the same thing in reverse. So it's kind of the selective conversation. Nobody's talking about a 360, right? And when you were talking, it occurred to me that in 4 areas I can think of already, this plays out. And one of them is the one you mentioned. The same people who are talking about crime don't, they think of it as black crime or, black on black crime, black on white crime. And they think about black people are the avatar for crime. And the reason they chose Willie Horton to publicize in the 1988 presidential campaign, the George H.W. Bush campaign, and their strategist, chief strategist, the late Lee Atwater, created the Willie Horton ad to demonize black people as a way of attacking their opponent, Governor Michael Dukakis from Massachusetts, the Democratic nominee. But so for a lot of folks, crime is synonymous with black people, and like immigration is synonymous with Latinos. But they don't think about white male crime. They don't think about the fact that every time I see a school shooting, a mass shooting, it's usually a white male. It's almost always a man as opposed to a woman. And it's almost always a white male. And it's a younger white male. It's someone between the ages of 18 and 23. You'd be surprised how many people are 21, right when the age that they're able to buy a gun legally. They'll go and buy a gun and use it. And so this is interesting to me because the same people who are talking about crime willingly and eagerly with regard to black people don't want to admit it when it comes to school shootings. January 6th, what I saw on January 6th was lawlessness. I saw a bunch of people in red hats, white people attacking cops, storming the Capitol, defacing, vandalizing. I saw lawlessness. I saw criminals, right? That's what I saw. But a lot of my white friends didn't see it that way. So there's an interesting dynamic at work there. And there's other instances too, but you get the idea. There is a tendency in the United States in politics when we have a conversation to only acknowledge what you're doing wrong, never admitting what I'm doing wrong.
Yeah, I totally agree. And now at the moment, as you know better than I do, you're living there. ICE is targeting immigrants based on skin color, et cetera. And there is this nonstop repeating of criminals, criminals, criminals. And what I point out to people, and I have not been able to get a response to the contrary or to contradict what I'm about to say, but I'm open to it and I'm open to talk about it. One thing that I did admire very much about Kirk is his willingness to talk and have an open discussion. I have not had that much luck as he had. Of course, he had more talent and whatnot, but I'm not looking to be a social media star. I'm not looking to start a movement. I just invite people to have face-to-face conversation from one human to another. And I cannot, for the life of me, get people to talk. They're just not interested. They're not willing. I don't know why. But one thing that I have mentioned is, for example, this criminals and somebody coming over the border illegally. Yes, obviously that's against the rules. It shouldn't be done, et cetera, et cetera. It's not a great thing. It's not a good thing. But there's two sides to the criminality here. One is the person crossing the border, obviously, without permission. Second is the people who are facilitating it on the employment side.
Yep.
All of these people are getting paid by somebody, and that somebody is typically an American citizen. Yeah. And they're people who are willing to save a buck rather than pay their fellow citizens a living wage. So this is criminal on many, many different levels, much more than somebody crossing the border. And I'll give you an example of how I feel about this. If you and I were in some kind of business together and I found out that you were cheating on me or you're stealing from me with one of the suppliers or something, I'm not going to go after the supplier and cut off my ties with him or punish the supplier. I mean, you're my business partner. So wouldn't a coherent president or a coherent country go after their fellow American citizens who are cheating their own people out of a living wage and hiring illegal immigrants? And then on top of that, sitting back and being quiet when these people are being harassed and arrested and treated like animals, when the real animals, as far as I'm concerned, or the ones that share the more blame here, are the American citizens.
Yes, I agree, absolutely. The employers are the big part of the story. You know, I've been writing about immigration for 37 years, and I have written about employers, and it's been a constant theme for me because neither party has an appetite for that for one simple reason. You talk about, wouldn't a country, want to come in and defend one group of people by, bringing to justice people who are exploiting them? Well, not when the people who are employing them, and I think there's some debate about the exploitation part, but only because I think immigrants have more power in various labor markets than we give them credit for. But the employers get off the hook because employers contribute money to politicians. Money is the key to all of it. It's always about money. And so the degree to which employers can fund political campaigns, if you decide tomorrow you want to run for Congress in California or anywhere around the country, it's expensive. It's an expensive proposition. That congressional seat could cost you in a small, minor media market, Montana someplace, could cost you $1 million. And in California, it could cost $25 million. And, it's typically not the Latino community, the immigrant community, the African-American community, the working class union community that produces that money. It's typically business owners that do. And so where I come from in Central California, you and I grew up, maybe 3 hours away from each other in Central California. It's all farm country, and farmers of all kinds, they produce so much agriculture in Central California that it feeds all of California, all of the country, and enough to export to Europe and other places in Asia. And they produce $50 billion with a B, $50 billion a year in revenue for the state of California. And they do that on the backs of undocumented immigrants, by and large. So the farmer is to be faulted for, and should be criticized for, not standing up for their workers when it's the workers that have made them wealthy. But at the same time, the farmer gives money to politicians in both parties. And so you don't hear politicians talking about going after employers. Example, when recently, and this has only happened, during the course of the second Trump administration, which we have to remind ourselves is only about 8 months old. Trump understood the economics of this, and he announced in the middle of this immigration crackdown that he was going to carve out an exemption for restaurant workers, hotel workers, and farm workers. That's what he said. I'm going to carve out an exemption. He said, why? Because they're hardworking people. They're good people. They're doing these jobs that nobody wants to do. He sounded like a Democrat. He sounded, or I give the Democrats too much credit, but he he sounded like an immigration advocate defending these immigrants because he understood the economics of it, that the guy who owns the restaurant, the guy who owns the hotel, and the guy who owns the farm, they all send money to the Republican Party. And that's ultimately why you never get Republicans talking about cracking down on employers. Now, that didn't last long because the anti-immigrant wing of his administration stifled that and basically rolled that back. But the fact that he said it at all kind of proves my point, which is you're never going to get Republicans talking about cracking down on employers for all their talk about law and order. They let employers get away with it. It's against the law under the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, IRCA, to knowingly hire an undocumented immigrant. It's punishable by a $10,000 fine, and per instance, that would bankrupt many of these farmers, hotels and restaurants. And if they're bankrupt, they can't give any more money to Trump. I mean, if you bankrupt the business, how am I supposed to send money to the Republicans running for Congress? So that's why all the fire breathers in Congress, all the people who want to get tough on immigrants, they always go soft on employers.
So do you think there's anything wrong with the analogy I've made about who in a coherent country or world or person, it makes much more moral sense to go after the American citizen rather than the immigrant? Or is there something wrong with the analogy there?
No, and the big guy, I think you go after the big guy, not the little guy.
Absolutely.
I became a journalist instead of going to work for Goldman Sachs, because even though in the 1980s, when I was at Harvard, there was a big push toward consulting. People wanted to work for McKinsey or Goldman Sachs or, all these places. And there was a real emphasis, not just on law, but corporate law and on corporations. And I became a journalist because I wanted to defend the little guy against the big guy. And at various times when I worked in Phoenix or in Dallas or in San Diego, I had the opportunity to do that, to defend the little guy against the big guy. And I always said, it's not really a game unless you're going after somebody in a column with your name and picture on it, so they know who you are, and going after the district attorney or the police chief, the mayor, the people with power. If you're not going after people with power, you're not doing journalism. Okay? If I wanted to step on undocumented immigrants who have a 6th grade education, who can't defend themselves, who don't speak the language, I would not have gone into journalism. I'd have gone into politics. Okay? Because that's what politicians do. So I'm all about taking care of the little guy and helping the little guy, defending them against the big guy. So to your point, should we be cracking down on U.S. citizens before the undocumented? Yes. And should we be going after the big guy before the little guy? Yes. The problem is, in our political system, the big guy has the resources, and the big guy shares his resources with politicians, which makes the politicians reluctant to bite the hand that feeds them.
Yeah, so this is, I think, is a fundamental flaw in the way democracies are organized, and American democracy in particular, because it's governed by money first and foremost. However, even that doesn't fully explain, in my view, why this topic is almost, from my perspective, almost completely ignored. I mean, why don't even normal people on social media talk about it? Nobody, you don't hear this.
The employer aspect of it, going after employers?
Yeah, the employer aspect of it, and who's really criminal here. And these people are here because they're being offered work and somebody's paying them. And it's not other really. Go ahead, please.
I'll tell you why. So I think there's an old phrase that my wife, who was born in Guadalajara and whose family is in Mexico, and again, I always have to say this, but came here as a child legally when she was a young girl. The old phrase about, in Spanish, it translates to, the devil is the devil not because of his evil ways, but because of his age. It's por viejo, the fact that he's been around. And so likewise, I've been around a long time, and I can remember in 1992, Bill Clinton was elected president. As a Democrat elected president. And in 1993, he began staffing his government. And he centered in on a person he wanted for attorney general. And her name was Zoe Baird. And she would have made perhaps a fine attorney general, except that in the digging of the vetting process for her in 1993, this is going back a long time, they found that she had hired an undocumented immigrant to be either a nanny or a housekeeper. And it had her for a number of years. She had hired this undocumented immigrant. At the time, this was in the pre-Trump years, this was considered a big deal. And this was enough to sink her nomination, and she eventually pulled out. Second person was put up for attorney general. Bill Clinton picked a judge, Kimball Wood. And he was set on putting in a woman. And good for him. He decided, I want to put in a woman. So he put in Kimball Wood. And lo and behold, how weird is this? The same problem. They found Kimball Wood also had hired an undocumented immigrant to be a nanny and a housekeeper. And people couldn't believe it in the media. What are the chances, right? So finally, he chooses a third woman. The article, he's like, I'm determined to get a woman. It's not lost on me. He gets Janet Reno. He picks Janet Reno, and Janet Reno is not married, has no kids, doesn't need a nanny, and has no nanny problem. So she's confirmed, and she becomes the attorney general. It's not lost on me that these accomplished women, these two before, Kimball Wood and Zoe Baird, as women, we expect so much of women. We expected them to provide for their family, to go to law school, to make a lot of money as a lawyer or judge or whatever, and still come home and do the housework. But no, the way they balance this out is by hiring somebody to do the housework for them. And it's this weird, impossible standard that we've set for women. But it's not lost on me that these were two women who ended up with this problem, not two men. Okay? So the point of the story is, what that should have taught us in 1993, Luis, and it's stayed true all the way to today. We don't have a problem with employers of undocumented immigrants, capital E. The capital E, big employer, big media, big pharma, big banking, big employer, we think farmer, contracting company, we think hotel, restaurant. These are the bad guys. No, we have a problem with employer little e. The little e employer is the American household. Most people don't write this or report this or say this, but it's true. The number one employer of undocumented immigrants in the United States of America is the American household. Okay?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Ruben. I wasn't clear from the beginning. That's exactly who I was talking about.
Yes. And so to your point, when you asked me, why don't people talk about this? Because, and here's the bottom line. Because the same people who would be writing those stories to talk about this at the Washington Post, at the New York Times, at CNN, at these places I've worked for, they have nannies, they have housekeepers, they have gardeners. These same journalists who would be blowing the whistle are themselves guilty. So they don't see it as a problem because I'm doing it. It's as if I'm an alcoholic, let's say, I drink a lot as a journalist, and we're looking at Donald Trump's health records, and we find out this guy's in remarkably good health, and we're suspicious of that because he eats all this fast food. Yeah, but you know what he doesn't do? He doesn't drink and he doesn't smoke. He doesn't drink and he doesn't smoke. And he says that his brother died of drinking and smoking, so he stays away from that stuff. And he taught his kids to stay away from that stuff. The journalists don't put those things together because guess what journalists do? We drink and we smoke. So in the mind of the journalists, we're never going to blow the whistle on that. We're always going to blame the Big Mac. The Big Mac is going to kill Trump, not the fact that he's not drinking and not smoking. You see, so if I'm guilty of the behavior as a journalist, don't expect me to get outraged about it. And that's what's happening with employment of undocumented immigrants. It is so pervasive with little e. The fact that the American household does it is so many journalists are guilty of it. We're never going to write about that.
That's precisely. I should have been clear from the beginning, but that's what I meant. Obviously, you do hear occasionally people say go after the employers. I have heard that occasionally, but I meant more the everyday person. I mean, the people that go to Home Depot to pick up all these people for work around the house or for the nannies. These people are common everyday people. All right, why do they go to Home Depot? They go to Home Depot because they don't want to pay their fellow citizens a proper wage.
Okay,
that's criminal.
I hear you, but let me push back on that.
Okay.
They go to Home Depot because it's worse than that. They go to Home Depot because their fellow citizens don't have the skill set, the work ethic to be able to do these jobs that immigrants do. And whether you're talking about picking avocados, I have seen this with my own eyes. I didn't learn this at Harvard. I learned this in an avocado grove orchard. I went to interview an avocado grower, and we go into the avocado fields. And he goes, "How's your Spanish?" And I said, "Not bad." And so I'm speaking to the workers in Spanish. And I go and I grew up in agriculture, but I've never seen anything like this. Avocados are a fruit, not a vegetable. They're a tropical fruit. They grow with other avocado trees. It has to be sort of warm, sort of moist. And they grow they're very finicky. So they grow in like the best places in California, San Diego, Santa Barbara, expensive places, right? Not too hot, not too cold. And I go in there and I see workers, who are standing on top of ladders, and the avocado trees have to be planted at an incline. I didn't know this, right? They have to be planted, they're inclined. They can't be like the trees I grew up in Central California, plum trees, nectarines, peaches, they're straight up. Okay. Well, if you're straight up on a plum tree or a peach tree, you can do it on a ladder that's straight up. But imagine being on a ladder that's on an incline. So in other words, there's guys on ladders picking avocados who are leaning backward, 12 feet off the ground. Okay? This is a bad fucking job. This is a dangerous fucking job. And this is the job that US citizens cannot do, will not do, don't have the skill set to do. If you put me up on that ladder as a US citizen, I don't care how much you pay me. The headline the next day with syndicated columnist breaks neck falling off ladder. So we get wrapped up in this debate about you need to pay a working wage. If you just paid more, all the kids from Starbucks would leave Starbucks. Hey guys, I'm paying $50 an hour to pick avocados. That they would leave Starbucks and go pick avocados. The problem is they don't fucking know how to pick avocados, because we in this country have not given the proper respect to immigrant workers. We don't understand, because we can't learn it at Harvard or in my desk here in my office. You have to get out there to the fields and see it. These jobs are more complicated than they look. Okay. These are skilled jobs, no matter what people say. They think that if you don't have an Ivy League degree, you're unskilled. Oh, bullshit. These are skilled jobs. And so I want to push back on that a little bit, because this is not just a question of what the employer pays. I am very sympathetic to employers who say, I'll pay whatever they want, but I can't get people to go over and do these jobs. And when they try to do it, they quit in 30 minutes. It's too hard or dangerous or whatever. So it's not about economics, brother. There's always the economist who comes in and says somehow it's all about economics. I said, no, bullshit. It's not always about economics. It's about the fact that there are jobs that people won't do at any price.
Yeah, point taken. However, on the other hand, if immigrants weren't there to do these jobs, people wouldn't die, right? People wouldn't die. The market would somehow correct, and either that product wouldn't be offered, or people would find a way around it. So it's not like if somebody doesn't eat an avocado, the world ends. It's a matter of people making decisions, right, and deciding to break laws to get what they want, and then pointing the finger at other people who just want to do work, who just want to work. And I think, to me, that's really criminal. Well, I hope this is the first of a series of conversations, Ruben. There's a lot to talk about. We barely covered any ground here. There's so many different things that I think we can contribute in a meaningful way to the conversation. I'd like to repeat an open invitation to any listener who happens to be listening to this, that all of these topics about DEI, about race, intelligence, crime, if you're looking for somebody to have a conversation with, a respectful conversation with, I offer myself. I happen to have studied intelligence under Richard Herrnstein at Harvard. Then I went on to get a PhD on the physical and mathematical foundations of intelligence and management. So I know a thing or two about these things, and I'd be happy to discuss them with you if anybody's willing. And I think Ruben feels the same way. He has built his whole career about conversing with the general public, and I think I speak for him, we'd be happy to, and certainly Ruben would be more than invited to come to the podcast to talk about these things with anybody who has a chip on their shoulder, or who thinks they're really, 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 really smart and we are really, 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 really dumb. We can come on the podcast, get it on camera, and spell out your case. Why is it that you think that you are so smart and we are so stupid. If that is the case, then it should be very, very easy, right, to demonstrate as much on camera, and you make your point,
Luis,
and everybody, go ahead.
If I may, I think I have a theory or two about why people don't want to get into the arena with you. And one is, and this will be obvious to you. I think you probably thought about this, but the issue of race, whenever race comes up, however it comes up, the very fact that you're Mexican American, you're Latino, I'm Latino, to invite people to come into the arena, they're afraid that they're going to be perceived as racist if they say out loud what they think. They're afraid that it's going to come back on them as being labeled that way. They probably see what's happening to Charlie Kirk, even in death, and they think about being accountable for some of what they think. I think that Trump has also given a green light to people to be more racist and say things out loud that they would never have thought and said otherwise. So maybe that concern. And there's another one too that's interesting. You and I have something else in common. We're members of Generation X, someone born in the 1960s. You know, for lack of a better indicator, I think it's from 1961 to like 1974 or so, somewhere in that ballpark. And as Xers, we're used to being in the arena. We're not easily shocked. You know, we're used to argument. We're used to, you know, everything turns into lucha libre at some point. We're okay with that. But this younger generation, if you look at your son and my son and my two daughters, as I said, my kids are a little older than yours, but they're 16, 18, and 20. And they come from Generation Z. And that generation, man, brother, it has been hard to get members of that generation to express opinions. Okay. The Charlie Kirk thing is a bit of a difference. He's a millennial. He was out there trying to engage Zers, you know, to tell him he was wrong. But when I go to college campuses and I speak to college students, they're very afraid. They either don't know what they think, they're confused by everything, or they're paralyzed and they don't want to take a position. And when I asked one once why this was, get this, I asked some Zers, you know, why is it that you're afraid to do this? They said, well, we grew up with cancel culture. We know that it's possible to say something and have it held against you later in a clip here. I don't want to lose a job, they said at some point, because somebody goes through my social media or finds something that I've said someplace and they hold that against me. And I'm attuned to that. It's so foreign to me. I'm like from Mars, they're from Venus, they're on a different planet, but I'm at least in touch with that. And let me give you one quick example. I have a product on my YouTube channel, Navarrette the Nation YouTube channel. It's called Simply Put. And it's the idea of a brainchild of my 16-year-old daughter, Vanessa, who said, Dad, we're always asking you questions. Explain this to me. What's DEI? Explain this, explain that. She says, why don't we do a thing where I ask you a question and you give me an answer and we put it on YouTube? So we've done 4 or 5 of these. Here's the interesting part, Luis. When we started doing this, it was very hard for me, challenging for me, because I kept wanting to express my opinion. I'm an opinion guy, for crying out loud. I've written over 4,000 opinion columns, right? The idea somehow that I could just give them the facts without the opinion was hard for me. And so my kids, I was with my 16-year-old and my 18-year-old, and they were taping me and they kept stopping me going, stop, cut, stop, cut. And I said, what am I doing? They said, we asked you about the big, beautiful bill, and it took you like 5 seconds before you're entering an opinion already. And, you know, no opinion, just give me the facts. And I fought it, but I eventually lost. And I gave in and they were right. But what does that tell me? That tells me something. It tells me that Generation Z is suspicious of opinion, doesn't want to be canceled, is afraid to express themselves. I know some of the people who don't want to get in the arena with you. We're not talking just about Zers, but there are people who are afraid to express themselves of all ages because they're afraid of any kind of blowback, pushback, you know, being called a racist, you name it. So you and I are different, you know, but other people are not like that. Anyway, long story.
I suppose that's a big factor. Well, I try to help people understand that I come from, I was mentored by Richard Herrnstein in a time where it was utterly taboo to talk about race and crime and intelligence. So don't be afraid. I know what I'm talking about. And it's okay to be academic and scholarly about these things and without being disrespectful to anybody. And I don't think anybody should be afraid of being canceled for having a simple conversation. Or at the very least,
I agree.
I suppose I'm speaking to the countless numbers of people who go onto these forums and onto the YouTube comment sections and offer their anonymously. Exactly.
Right.
You know,
They don't want to be accountable.
Yeah, exactly. And not to mention that so often the people who are making these strong opinions have no idea what they're talking about. They just don't. They are literally really utterly ignorant about these topics. They just don't know the basic facts about IQ, about intelligence, about how it works, about what the data tells us. They just are utterly ignorant, and they go by their own self-assessed intelligence. Like Charlie Kirk, if you listen to his videos, he was absolutely gifted speaker, but he was not an intellectual. He had no new ideas, no new take on anything other than the prosperity gospel, the typical Protestant American prosperity gospel, and this strange obsession with associating Christ and the markets when it's like the exact opposite.
Here's what he had going for him, and I think you can appreciate this. It's sort of a rigged game in favor of people like Kirk, because Kirk could get the blessing of other white men who believed as he believed. If you see on Fox News or elsewhere white men who, as I like to say, were born on third base, but act like they hit a triple, people who agreed with Charlie Kirk that any black woman in a position of power or influence got there because she stole the job from a more qualified white guy, then they bless him and they say, Charlie Kirk's so smart, he's so smart, he's so smart. I don't know where it was, but I had this epiphany once. I was listening to talk radio, I think, and I heard a white male talk radio host bless another one saying, oh, the so-and-so, author just wrote this great book and blah, 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 blah. And I thought, my God, this is what I listen to all day. I hear one white male blessing another one, vouching for another one, vouching for another one. And so what Charlie Kirk had was the fact that a lot of prominent people in the media, be they Tucker Carlson or Bill O'Reilly or Sean Hannity or Jesse Waters or whoever, and also some people in the middle of the road, Mark Halperin and others who liked Kirk. They liked what he said. They didn't take offense to it. They didn't see it as racist or sexist or any of those things. And they blessed him. They vouched for him. And our reality is different. Okay. We're not like that. We don't have that experience. We don't have a media in the United States that's dominated by Latinos of our generation who can vouch for us and say, hey, Luis, he's terrific. Luis Razo, he's really smart. Let's bring him in. We don't have that, ecosystem. But when you're the white men who are running everything, they can bless each other. And so that's how one day I said, how do I know that so-and-so, that John Smith is so smart? Oh, I know because, Ted Simmons said he was really smart. I'm like, what the fuck? Well, how did we get here? I'd been fed all this stuff into my brain, and I had to deprogram myself and realize that this was a lot of one person vouching for another that had gotten into my psyche.
Yeah, exactly. I think you're absolutely right. That's certainly one element that's very palpable and real about white privilege. I mean, if you are a white person, especially a white male like Charlie Kirk, a billionaire American is many, many, many times more likely to sponsor you and to finance your activity than that person is for any other race. It's just this is the way it works.
Yep.
But in any case, Ruben, there's a lot more to talk about. I'd like to talk about what to do about this, what you think is going to be next, where the U.S. is heading, root causes, potential ways forward. I think these are very interesting and important questions. And I think, maybe I'm wrong, but I think that's where the ultimate value is going to be seen, and the investment that the U.S. has made in profiles like yours and mine in contributing to this conversation at a deep intellectual level, that's not necessarily aligned with the popular social media channels or popular discussions, but really grasps deeply the importance of ideas, the importance of history, to how things develop in the real world. I think ideas matter. And if you don't understand ideas, and certainly if you're pushing bad ideas, then that's going to have consequences on the world that you create. And I think the US, unfortunately, is now a victim of a series of very bad ideas that go back several centuries, primarily from the Anglo-Protestant Reformation and rebellion against the Mediterranean tradition, a more Jewish and Catholic tradition. But in any case, I'd like to talk about these things and give more about your take on the tragedy of what's happening with these ICE roundups. A tragedy from our perspective. I think some people see it as a circus and they enjoy it a lot. Which, by the way, I'm happy to talk to anybody about anything, any perspective on ICE. Like I said, I'm not a left winger. If anybody thinks after this conversation that I'm somehow a left winger or a right winger, I try to be reasonable about my positions, and I think that's reflected as well in your position in the center, and something that I've watched you develop over the last several years, and I think I respect you a lot more for that, for not taking sides. I don't know about how you feel, but nowadays, whenever I see anybody take like a strong left or a strong right position, I think these people are not very smart.
They're not being honest, and they don't understand the issue. If you have all the answers, you don't understand the questions. I definitely see that more and more. It's okay to say, I don't know, after you've thought about something from a 360 perspective. And you're right, I do find a lot of people who are locked in and who don't allow for any new information to come in and change their mind. And I try not to be like that. There are some issues like the immigration raids where I find it very difficult to find anything positive here. Okay.
Well, let me give you something positive very quick. Let me give you something positive very quickly. I think, and this should be an example, as much as I deplore Donald Trump and what he represents, in my mind, I think one of the best things that he could have ever done was close the border. I think this is a very, very good thing. Very, very good thing. Stop the exploitation, let America deal with its own problems, and don't allow American criminals to basically invite poor people from Latin America to come in, to hire them for wages that are less than what their fellow Americans are willing to work for.
Yeah.
So I think that was a very, very good thing. So I think
that's a
kudos to Trump and kudos to his followers for accomplishing that. I don't think it was a minor feat. I think he really deserves genuine applause for that.
One thing I agree with you, and I think that's a very good point. That's a very interesting point. I like when you said, let America deal with its own problems. The current system allows for an immigrant workforce to come in and paper over this problem that we have, because we've raised now 3 generations that won't do these jobs. And so I'm all for not papering over that anymore, and really kind of giving America a mirror, saying, okay, look, this is where you are. So I like that. I wanted to mention one thing that we can talk about in the future when we come back together. And that's, you mentioned bad ideas. You talked about ideas and the power of ideas, and put to what you were saying, bad ideas have bad consequences. You've said bad ideas, bad things happen. Bad ideas have bad consequences. And before I talk, I wrote down this thought that was running through my head about the costs of these bad ideas by Trump and by MAGA to America. And I think any of the 5 of these would be worth exploring later. But it's hurt and weakened our perspective on law and order. It's got very confused about what's lawful and unlawful. You have a president who's been indicted of multiple felonies, who's now talking about the importance of the rule of law, right? So we're confused. Americans are confused about law and order. Police jurisdictions. There used to be a time where you had local, state, federal, and they didn't cross over into each other's lanes. The degree to which there's any kind of intermixing has been troubling. Add to that the military, and the fact that, once upon a time, not long ago, the military stayed out of our U.S. cities. Now there's open talk about sending them to Chicago and places. That's new and different and bad. The tension between local, state, and federal governments, federalism. Well, you and I learned in college about federalism, about the debate at the founding of the country about a strong federal government versus respect for states' rights. And how does all that fit together, right? All that's been turned upside down in favor of a strong federal government stomping over the states. The racial dynamic, the fact that, are we becoming more racist? Thanks to Trump, as I said, people are saying things out loud they shouldn't be saying, haven't been saying, and would never say before. And lastly, here's this one. This is almost unique to you and me as Mexican Americans, but the idea of citizenship. I would say that Mexican Americans in particular, because we're always accused of having divided loyalties, we've thought a lot about citizenship. And there's a lot of people in your family or my family who, because they're US citizens, really felt empowered and protected. And that turns out to not to be the case in this administration. There are hundreds upon hundreds of US citizens who are being detained, wrestled to the ground. You can get into trouble at an ICE raid by videotaping them. If you're a US citizen, again, I was born in this country. Both my parents were born in this country. 3 of my 4 grandparents were born in this country. Multiple great grandparents were born in this country through Texas. I've never thought about citizenship. I don't even know where my birth certificate is, right? Because I'm a US citizen. I take it for granted. But that's not the case anymore, because there are US citizens by virtue of skin color, or even white folks who are videotaping them, who are wrestled to the ground, detained for days, and then let go. They're not deporting US citizens. Where would they deport us to? But they're not deporting us. But they will detain me, arrest me, apprehend me, put me in zip tie, put me in the back of the car, leave me in some detention center for 4 days before they let me go as a US citizen. So the idea of citizenship, you and I could talk just about that one day, because I think that Mexican Americans have very complicated, and it turns out very inaccurate perspectives on what it means to be a US citizen.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I've known this from the very beginning, from a young age. So it's not surprising to me. I don't know why anybody should be surprised. This has been the American attitude toward us from day one, and it's never going to change. It isn't. It's been not obviously all Americans, but it's been an important aspect of the birth of the United States and the development of the United States and its ideas. This is just a continuum. What's happening now, it's just a continuum. And anybody who is Mexican American, if you happen to be very European, you're going to be okay. But the instant that any element of the indigenous background shows, trust me, you're not part of the in group. In any case, yeah, there's a lot more to talk about. I should add that we've been talking today about social issues and whatnot, but I'd like to open up the conversation and the invitation for anybody to talk about anything, about anything in particular. If you like the sciences, if you like anything that you want to talk about, that we're open for it. I think we can have an interesting conversation and let your ideas be heard. And certainly, if you think that Ruben and I don't deserve what was in some sense granted to us through affirmative action or DEI, let's talk about it. Okay, fantastic, Ruben. Thanks so much for your time today. I took a lot more than I thought, but it's been fun. I appreciate it.
Yeah, my brother, it's so good to be with you. It's a joy. Your friendship is really a blessing to me. I appreciate being on your program. I look forward to the next time. Un abrazo.
Un abrazo, Ruben.